think about it, we know a lot more about brands today, and we know a lot more about brands than the companies that are behind them. Many people know Kimberly-Clark, but even more people know Kleenex. And many people know Procter & Gamble and all of its brands. Crest toothpaste is a brand in itself. Crest is widely known, but it's got about 10 variations. And of course, that's just in the US. Other places they might call it something else. But again, the brand is powerful. The brand sells. And Lackawanna did a great job with this. Okay, next slide, please. It started out, of course, in the late 40s by building a passenger train called the Phoebe Snow. It was a great train. It was a very nice train. It wasn't a very economical train. And one of the reasons for that, if you look at the picture, which is probably when it was brand new and just out of the shop, so to speak, it's got 8 or 10 cars in there. Hard to say exactly how many, but the typical consist was 8 or 10 cars. Now, think about that. Think about the number of seats, the number of revenue spaces that can generate. This is a big problem. It has been documented over the years, and it goes pre-Amtrak and it goes post-Amtrak, that the only way to make money on a passenger train, and we're talking about making money above the rail, that's not to say it's going to make money below the rail. Below the rail means it's going to return on your investment. It's going to give you money back to build the tracks better. It's going to give you money back to buy new equipment when the old equipment wears out. But making money above the rail means that you're simply covering all your operating costs. Fuel, crew costs, dispatching costs, some overhead costs like the passenger department that are directly allocable to the passenger service, but not necessarily the cost of the full cost of the chief engineer or the for instance, the mechanical department. You're covering the direct costs, but not the overhead costs. So at least you're not losing money, you're not hemorrhaging. But I've talked about those criteria. What makes it profitable above the rail? And the answer is very simple. It's a ratio called passenger miles per train mile. That means how many passengers were in a seat for 1 mile for every mile that the train operated. And the answer to the equation is 500, roughly. 500 passenger miles per train mile, or 500 people on the train at any given time, mostly for the whole trip or part of the trip and get replaced by others. When you get up to 400 or 500, you're starting to see some money coming in. Below that, you're not. So look back again at this 8 or 10 car train, and obviously there was some revenue coming in on the railway post office car, and maybe a little bit in the express shipments, but not a great deal. Certainly enough to cover 1 car. But the coaches were, if I recall, 62 seats. So 4 of them is 240 odd seats. And if you throw the westbound sleeping car into the mix, that brings it up to about 260. And that's it. That's it. You can't get to that 400 to 500, even if you stuffed every seat full and every berth in the sleeper full. So you start off with your hands tied. And that's something that very few railways knew. They started to learn that pretty quickly as the 50s went on. And as a consequence, what was making money prior to Amtrak, right up to Amtrak, well, it was a train like the Silver Meteor, a train like the Denver Zephyr, a train like the combined Super Chief and El Capitan. Think about those trains. They ran 16, 18, 20 cars, and a lot of them were coaches, so they were hauling a lot of people. They got a lot of special moves. The Denver Zephyr was hauling Boy Scouts to the west, and tour groups and ski groups. The Florida trains were jam-packed most of the year, not all of it, but pretty healthy loads. And that was what made those trains last in pretty good shape up to Amtrak. And it's one of the reasons why the Lackawanna service did not. Next, please. What the Lackawanna did, though, during the 50s and even the 60s was keep the service in pretty good shape. It never deteriorated to the point that some others did. The Penn Central, one of my railroads, was not very proud of its service. Some of us were, not all of them. And some of the service went pretty far downhill. The food service, the condition of the equipment. Not so with the Lackawanna. Right up to the end, practically, these nice pieces of equipment were offering quality service, nice amenities, good food. Now they were handicapped in the food department because, except for the 2 cars built for the Phoebe Snow, the others were hand-me-down, rebuilt cars that they had a struggle to keep going. But they did, and it worked well. Nobody challenged the Lackawanna on their train-off petitions for bad service. It was just, we don't want to see the trains go away. Next, please. Another thing, the physical plant was pretty good. Now, this picture got swapped out. We didn't intend to show locomotive, we intended to show the right-of-way, but my IT guy that put the thing together got the wrong picture here. But in any event, you know, as well as I do, that those massive concrete viaducts and fills and the manicured right-of-way was kept up pretty much to the end. Sure, double track was singled, but other than that, the railway was in pretty good shape as right up to the 70s when the real economic crunch came and the hurricanes and so forth. But basically, you were dealing with a pretty good railroad. Not a super speed railroad, not a very direct railroad in some respects, and certainly they had their mountains and hills to contend with. But it was a pretty good operation all the way to the 60s, let's say. Next, please. They had scenery to sell. It wasn't the Rocky Mountains. It wasn't the Hudson River, but it was nice scenery, and it was a good railroad to see the scenery from. You had the Poconos, of course. You had some fairly pleasant views in the southern tier of New York and western New York. And the trains were a good view, good vista to see that lovely scenery. Think about it even in today's terms with the fall leaves turning color. Lackawanna was a great way to see that. And they did take advantage of that. They did point out the sightseeing opportunities. Next, please. The markets were pretty good, not great, but pretty good. The Poconos, of course, were even then a resort destination, not quite in the same vein as they are today, but certainly an attractor. The universities in the area were big even then, and there were some just a little bit offline, like Hamilton College, like Cornell, that were reachable or could have been reachable by connecting bus service. They had universities along the line in Alfred, New York. They had, of course, the universities in New York and the universities in Buffalo. So that's a big market. It's not an everyday market, but it can be. professors, researchers, people that sell things to universities, they're always coming and going. It's a big economic activity. And then, of course, the students. The cities were not well served by air. They were, in fact, very poorly served by air. And as a consequence, with perhaps the exception of New York and Buffalo, there was no real air competition. But there was plenty of bus competition. Next, please. Now let's look at what some of the problems were that they were facing. The equipment that they managed to scrape up enough dollars to buy were for 2 trains and a few odd extra coaches and sleepers that ran on various lines throughout the East, but not enough to re-equip. And there are some of us that would contend that they bought the wrong equipment. They bought 4 cars from the Bud Company, a handful from ACF. They rebuilt a few RPOs in their own shop, and that was it. So you basically had 3 builders, themselves, Bud and ACF. Now that's a mistake when you have a small fleet. It means you have to have a lot more parts, a lot more expertise, and because only the Bud cars were stainless steel, they had a lot of steel cars that had to be repainted. Well, everything was repainted, even the stainless steel, which some of us would consider a mistake. And the repainting had to be regular or they'd rust. And when they rusted, you had to do corrosion repairs. Next, please. There's one of the ACF cars. And you can see there's lots of stuff going on underneath the car. These cars, like most of the cars built after World War II, were based on antique technology, which is called steam heat. Steam heat worked sometimes, but it also was very cantankerous and difficult to maintain. The eastern roads were famous for it. Of course, the eastern roads had some pretty rough climates, but the question was always asked, did you run steam through the train or did you run the train through steam? Because they were always leaking clouds of steam. Next, please. There's one of the stainless steel cars. It's a very lovely car, very nice paint job, but why would you paint stainless steel? Other than the fact that you wanted it to match everything else. So, again, if they had a little bit more foresight, perhaps the stainless steel would have been predominant. Perhaps the steam heat, and this is an indictment for the whole industry, perhaps the steam heat would have gone away because we knew how to heat cars electrically since about 1910, when the first MU cars were built, and even subway cars. That was not rocket science technology, but when you have an industry based on steam locomotives, that's what you do. So, again, more maintenance, more difficulty. Now, what would have happened had they bought a completely stainless steel fleet? Next, please. This is just where I said the painting, the rust cost. Next, please. Now, those cars lasted 10, 20, 30 years. There's still a handful around in museums or preserved, but in regular service, they lasted from 1948 to about 1970. Not very long as cars go. If they bought stainless steel cars, on the other hand, there's a picture of the Canadian on the left as it was in 1955, brand new, spanking new, right out of the shop in Philadelphia, the Bud Company. And there it is this year in Toronto, looking much the same, other than the fact that the red stripe is now a blue stripe. This train is in better condition now than it was 70 years ago. It was rebuilt many times. Via Rail Canada keeps it up to date. It's beautiful inside. It's easy to maintain outside. And just to check, Transport Canada, their regulatory body, required via to take a few of these cars out of service and destructively test them to see if they could last, because it was obvious, even if they got some money for new cars, which they have just done, these cars would have to last another 10 years, so they didn't want anything unsafe running. Well, they took 4 of them apart, tore them down, squeezed them. A railroad car in North America has to be squeezed to 800,000 pounds and then come back down to level after the squeeze is over, or it fails. And they did. They squeezed it, and it came right back down, and it was fine. And they concluded that these cars will last at least 10, maybe 20 more years. My guess is they would last indefinitely if you just kept rebuilding the systems. That may not be economical, but the point I'm making here is this is a 70-year-old train still in punishing 6,000-mile service. Next, please. Okay, let's get done with the hardware and talk a little bit about the business stuff that goes into making a passenger service. The Lackawanna, like every other railroad in the U.S., was hamstrung by the Interstate Commerce Commission. The ICC was almost a punitive regulatory body, and it started out basically in 1877 or thereabouts because the railroads were exercising monopolistic power. Apparently nobody ever got the message that they were no longer a monopoly by the 40s and 50s. So the ICC just kept going in that straight line, and if you wanted to do things interesting with freight service, that was really where it hurt. But in passenger, if you wanted to change a fare, it usually took months and months and paperwork you wouldn't believe. And then there were fare divisions. That's, you made a fare from A to B, but you might have to divide it between railroads. And if there was a shorter fare from A to B or a shorter route, you had to match the shorter route. And there were routes that were so complex nobody would ever buy them, and yet people spent countless hours before the ICC filing these tariffs on passenger fares that would never be used. In Canada, the Canadian National in the 60s said, this is crazy. We're not subject to the ICC. Let's just throw the whole fare system out and put a new one in, and they did. They knew when the trains loaded heavily and they knew when they were empty. And so they created red, white, and blue fares. They knew which trains were medium, which were heavy, which were light, and the red, white, and blue simply attached fares to those levels. And they published these fares. I don't know if we had a photo of it, but they put a red, white, and blue chart out. And when they put it out to the point where every refrigerator in Canada had a magnet with a red, white, and blue fare chart on it. And you knew if you wanted to save money, you went to the red fare. If you couldn't do that, you looked for a white fare. And finally, if you had no choice or you had to go to a business meeting, you took the blue fare. And that meant changing your day or train of travel. But it worked. In 10 years, they raised business 10%. There were a lot of other things involved, new equipment, better service, but basically just modernizing the whole concept. In the 60s, we were shedding passenger trains like leaves in the fall, and they were building them up, putting more trains on, building up passengers. The fares were a big deal. Here you see a typical Lackawanna page from their timetable. Lots of fine print, lots of fares that made no sense at all. They made sense because they were traditional. They were just a continuum of the fares that were established in 1920 and 1930 and 1940. You put 5% on here, 2% on there. They were not incentive fares. They did not give the public a reason to ride. Not a good reason anyway. Next, please. The bus competition was strong. I mentioned that before. There were about 15 trips a day from New York to Scranton on a couple of different carriers. And in fact, there still are. But it was a real difficult situation to compete with buses because buses were on publicly funded highways. And when it got to the point where the buses could go almost as fast as the train, that was pretty serious competition. It wasn't the nice service you'd get on the Lackawanna, but it was there, it was cheap, and great for students. Next. Okay, we talk about discouraging innovation. I mentioned the Interstate Commerce Commission. They were Big Brother. Big Brother didn't want you to do anything innovative. Not because they had anything against the railroad or innovation. You seem to be cutting out.
Yeah, I don't know what causes that.
I do not know why. I apologize for that. In any event, they didn't have anything against the railroads. They had something against change. My significant other says, I hate change. And most people do, but when you're the Interstate Commerce Commission and you hate change, that can hamstring the whole industry, and it did. It helped bring down the passenger train industry to a great extent. Not maybe as much as the interstate highway system, but it sure had a big effect. There was some competition from the railroad side. Obviously, the New York Central was a big competitor on the Buffalo market and Syracuse. The Lackawanna had the Pocono market. The Lackawanna could have had a little bit more. They could have had a bigger market on the southern tier, but they were, again, one of two there. They were competing with the Erie until they merged. And they were competing with Lehigh Valley, which was a second sister, poor sister to the Lackawanna, but still it was there. And in the 50s, in the early 50s, these were choices that business travelers and others made. Next, please. The Amtrak thruway idea, actually the previous picture was an Amtrak thruway bus terminal in Bakersfield, California. And Amtrak runs, I believe, 7 trains a day from the Bay Area and Sacramento to Bakersfield. And then thruway buses, which are single ticket from A to B, connect there and take you to all points in Southern California and even as far away as Las Vegas. So it's a great idea, and they've expanded it nationwide. It's a guaranteed connection. It's a single ticket. You can find their information on the Amtrak website. It's just a wonderful idea, and there's no reason that the Lackawanna couldn't have done this or any other railroad. Some did, although generally the ICC again frowned upon such arrangements. They made it a little more difficult. But again, nobody was really merchandising the ability for a person to get from A to B on a single ticket using a bus connection. It just wasn't done in those days, and it should have been. Next, please. The Lackawanna merchandised its longer distance markets, such as New York to Chicago using the nickel plate, and a few others. But that was pretty small potatoes compared to the basic New York State and Pennsylvania market that could have existed, perhaps. Next. Periodicity. What is periodicity? It means that there's a memory pattern schedule. Train leaves every hour. Train leaves every 2 hours, and it's always on the hour or the half hour or the '07. The idea that someone doesn't have to look at their watch, they just know, well, the clock strikes 7 minutes after, there's going to be a train here every 7 minutes. Amtrak has rejected that concept pretty thoroughly. They do not have any truly periodic memory schedules anywhere in the country, although there are pieces of routes that do. But generally they've said, no, it's not going to happen. And when I worked at Amtrak, my boss, Dean Folsom, the general manager of transportation, was off to Boston and Maine. And I said, what about the Boston and Maine? Did they have memory schedules? He said, no, we had an old general superintendent, and his theory was, every train's got its own personality. Well, that doesn't help the market. Okay, memory schedules. The Empire Service in New York State, the New York Central Empire Service, could it have helped the Lackawanna? Could they have done something like that? In 1967, December 3rd to be precise, we replaced all the long-distance trains within New York State with a memory pattern, every 2 hours to Albany from New York and every 4 hours to Buffalo. And we cleaned up the schedules, made them as fast as they had ever been, and I might add a little bit faster than they are today. And we took 2 long-distance trains and blended them into the pattern, and it worked pretty well. There's a typical Empire Service train. We cleaned up the costs. We got the minimum number of locomotives. We had a one-man train crew, a conductor only. And the way that worked, it was in those days, the Order of Railway Conductors, and the conductors had an agreement, one person on a small train. And because we had up to 4-car trains, what we would do was put the vestibules together so there'd be 2 sets of vestibules in a 4-car train. Well, who did the other? If the one conductor could open 2, the snack bar attendant, although they didn't have to, volunteered to open the other 2. They'd excuse themselves from the snack bar and help out. And by that kind of team spirit, we made this service quite effective. Next, please. That was the first Empire Service schedule in 1967. Next. And there's the memory pattern. It's hard to see, but I've just described it. Every 2 hours to Albany, every 4 hours to Buffalo. Now, the Empire Service had in its history 2 golden eras. The first one was about a year after we put it in. The New York Central maintained it impeccably. We had 45 operating management trainees sent out in the field to make sure everything worked. We were told by the guy that developed it, Robert D. Timpany, who was the Assistant Vice President of Operating Administration, you have no authority to do anything, but you have responsibility to make this service work. And we took that seriously, and it did work. The other golden era was a few years later under Amtrak. The head of Empire Service was none other than Wes Coates. And during Wes's administration, many innovations were made, many trains won travel awards, equipment was shuffled to optimize it, but not before and not since then under Amtrak has it been as successful. Next. Okay, this was a very good thing. It made our service profitable, and it made it profitable for 2 reasons. Number one, the big trains, the long-distance trains that were left, and some of the the Buffalo trains, were achieving this passenger miles per train mile ratio. We're getting close to it. But the real secret was we stripped the costs out. We got rid of, we had a full engine crew. We had a fireman in those days, but we had no brakeman. And the equipment was all homogeneous. All of our Pullman Standard 3000 series coaches, nothing else. The engines were the best we had. The basic cost structure was such that once they got west of the electric zone at Harmon, the costs were fairly minimal. So because all the costs were on the east end of Grand Central to Harmon, the Albany trains didn't quite make money, but the Buffalo trains and the West trains did make money. Next, please. And this is the confidential internal profitability chart for the first year of Empire service. And I know you can't read the numbers, but that was $738,831 of net profit the first year on the New York State service. And that was from a massive loss before it. And of course, after that, what happened? The Penn Central merger happened in February of '68. And as a consequence, the thing went to hell, just like the railroad itself. We had a general manager of the Eastern region who was sent up there early on in the merger, a fellow named Pat King, and he was an old Pensy guy who hated passenger trains. And he did everything in his power to ruin that service. I have some internal letters when the Public Service Commission, which was watching over it, looked carefully at it. They said, you're going to have to come up here and report. The service was running great before you got there. So he sent a letter to the Vice President of Operations, a fellow named David Smucker, and said, I have to testify. What do you want me to say? And Smucker's response was, as usual, lie, promise you'll do better. So that was the stuff that was happening at Penn Central, and it's why Empire service went downhill. But in any event, I'm not here to talk about Empire service. I'm here to talk about Lackawanna. Could this have been put in on Lackawanna? Sure. Why not? Would it have saved it? I don't know. The Lackawanna was doing its best under the very trying circumstances of equipment that was not optimal, a route that, while it was good, it had good markets. It wasn't New York, Albany, Buffalo. And I say that emphatically because Albany is a state capital. The best way you can generate ridership is to connect the biggest city in a state with the state capital. And that's true whether it's Chicago to Springfield, Philadelphia to Harrisburg, New York to Albany, and you could go on and on and on. So Lackawanna didn't have that. They had smaller cities. Now, the smaller cities in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and even more today, basically got hollowed out. These were downtowns where you'd go down to Boscov's store or the big supermarket, or you'd do all your shopping in the downtown. You could take a local bus or a trolley. They were people-friendly, pedestrian-friendly. These cities, and I could name several of them, but obviously Scranton is one, Harrisburg is another, although Harrisburg is a state capital, so it's got its core of politicos who might have a very expensive apartment downtown and a few hangers-on that serve the political environment, but the rest of it is pretty well hollowed out. There's not much to downtown Harrisburg. Altoona is another. And you could go on and on through the Northeast. These things happen. They happen to the Lackawanna. And as a consequence, the cities disappeared and the suburbs or the rural areas became completely attached to the automobile. So that was a great shot when the government in 1956 said, we're going to build the interstate highway system. and it's going to help defense. Well, I don't know that it ever helped defense, but it sure helped the auto industry, and it didn't help the railroad industry. So with the hollowing out of our downtowns, the push towards automobile traffic, and the things that were going on at the railroad, plus in the Northeast we had the Rust Belt conditions. You just heard this morning about the decline of the anthracite business. All that conspired by the 60s to really make the Northeastern railroads suffer very painful deaths. And of course, it took a complete rethink under Conrail to do better than that. But again, when you're trying to serve your shareholders, you have to worry about profit. You have to shed anything that's not making money, or that's not making as much money as you could with the money that you're investing in it. So the Lackawanna did its best, but it just didn't have any wiggle room. Next. Now, finally, the lesson, we're up to the end. What's the lesson for the future? Amtrak's talking about a New York to Scranton business. It'll probably happen, maybe, although obviously everything is a gamble with the Trump administration. But it might well happen. However, like anything else in this country, it will take time. The New Jersey Transit is extending the commuter service 7 miles or so to Blairstown, and that's been going on for 10 years, and it's nowhere near completed. Andover, excuse me. And in that 10 years, the Chinese have built 25,000 miles of 200-mile-an-hour railroad. So things like this can be done. What do they mean for this? We don't know. We know the lessons. We know what the market should be doing. We know how to connect it. But do we have an administration in Amtrak and the politicos that support it